Obrigado por terem vindo para a palestra da professora Judith Bronstein. E vou mudar agora para inglês para entender também, né? So, thank you very much for coming here again. It was 1 year ago and it feels like yesterday. It's amazing. So, it's a great honor to have you here. And Professor Bronstein works mainly with mutualisms and plant-animal interactions, and I'm sure most of you read something that she wrote. She wrote books and reviews and research papers, and she has been especially carrying out research on the positive and negative balance between mutualism and antagonism, especially in ant lepidopteran systems and plants, yes? And today she's going to talk to us about the conservation biology of mutualism. So, once again, it's an honor to have you here. We are big fans of yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be back, and it's wonderful to see some of you who I got to know very well on my last trip, and to meet new friends. I'm here to go to the evolution meeting that's going to be near Sao Paulo next week, but I was actually more excited to come back here. So it's a real pleasure, and I thank Marco and his lab so much for making it possible. Let me also say that I've given Marco a copy of this presentation, and he's going to put it on the graduate student blog. So if some of it goes by kind of fast, and there's references that are on here, you'll be able to get them afterwards. I'm also being taped over there. So,
I forgot to say
yes.
something. Sorry. And we are also recording the talk on video. Lucas Perillo is making a video about the talk, and so he's going to post it in Bocaina channel in YouTube.
Great. So I wanted to talk today. So last year when I was here, I gave you a research talk about what I was working on. And I wanted to do a different kind of talk this time. I wanted to talk about the conservation biology of mutualism, which is something that is a fairly new topic very broadly. Thinking about what do we know about what kind of threats mutualisms are under, what we can do about them, what kinds of questions should we be asking. And as I put together the talk, I realized that my lab had actually done quite a lot in this area. So I will be highlighting the work mostly of my graduate students and postdocs, because I think some of their contributions are really exciting in this area. So when we think traditionally about conservation, we often think about it on a species-by-species basis, right? You know, we're concerned about pandas, or we're concerned about jaguars. And many, at least in the US, many of the mechanisms we put in place in an interest in conservation are based on individual species. This is the species I talked about last year, Datura wrightii. It's a very, very large flower in the Solanaceae family. But of course, species don't occur in isolation. And so, increasingly, there's a recognition that if we're going to conserve the species and habitats that we love, we have to take into account the interactions in which the species are involved. So, for instance, if we're interested in that very large flower, we have to think also about the species it interacts with. So, about its pollinators, for example. About the animals that disperse the seeds. The species that eat this plant, certainly if we're interested in conserving the plant, we want to think about its enemies. We want to think about plants that are competing for the pollinators. We want to think about seed dispersers. And then we want to think about the pollinators themselves, which are specialists. So we have to take into account whole networks of interactions if the goal is to conserve the species we like. So we can assume then that the species that should be at particular risk, the ones we need to worry about in conservation, are the ones whose success really depends on other species. So in the case of, in the case of this plant, we need to be particularly concerned about the only insect that pollinates that plant. We can't conserve the plant unless we conserve the specialist pollinator. We can't conserve this plant unless we conserve the more generalized seed dispersers it has, and so on. So that species whose success depends on other species should be those that are at particular risk. Because not only do we need to worry about things like how global change affects this species, but also how it affects the mutualists. Well, is that actually true? Is it true that species that have these dependencies on other species are particularly at risk? It turns out that we don't know. It's really quite logical that it should be the case that species whose success depends on other species should be in a particularly bad situation, for instance, with global change. But the study of mutualism is a really young field, and we haven't even gotten to the point where we're being very good at posing questions, right? Let alone knowing what their answers are. So it's a very exciting time to think about conservation of mutualism, and it's also a really urgent time to think about conservation of mutualism. So what I want to do here is address 4 questions. It's, the pointer is right under the off button. So it makes me very nervous. First, I want to give you some background about mutualism. Some of you know this very well. Some of you, it will be new information. What traits predict how fragile or susceptible to disruption mutualism are? So which mutualisms should be more and less likely to be disrupted? What are the major threats in a conservation success? Sense, what are the things we have to worry about mutualism? What can we do about it? Can we rescue mutualisms that are under threat? And then what do we see as the future? What are the next steps that need to be taken? Okay, so first, some things about mutualism. Till now, I've assumed you all remember everything you ever learned about mutualism, but let's review the simple things. So mutualism is a mutually positive interaction. Each species is exploiting others to get what they need to survive and reproduce. So, for instance, that's a bat visiting a cactus flower, a saguaro flower, in the habitat where I live, and that's a pollination mutualism. So in each case, there is mutual benefit on each side, really via exploitation. Species 1 exploits 2, and in turn is exploited, and it works out for the benefit of both the species. Now, there's no doubt that mutualisms are everywhere. They used to be thought of as fairly rare interactions. They're not rare. They're everywhere we want to look. They're in terrestrial habitats, aquatic habitats, temperate habitats, and tropical habitats. I have to say Brazil is about the best place I've ever been for the study of mutualism. They're everywhere, they're exciting, and they're not very well known. So there's a universe of things that can be studied, which is really exciting. Let's review sort of the main categories of mutualisms. Once again, both the species are acquiring something that would otherwise be impossible or very expensive for them to get. So there's an exchange going on. Pollination mutualisms are certainly the best studied mutualisms. In these mutualisms, there's an animal that is visiting flowers, usually for food in the form of nectar. And then the plant is getting its pollen moved between flowers. And in the vast majority of pollination mutualisms, the pollinator is not actively making a decision to move pollen. It happens in the process of the animals visiting the flowers for food. Seed dispersal mutualisms are similar in many ways. There is an exchange of food for transport. So here we have a bat mutualism in honor of Marco's lab. In seed dispersal mutualisms, the animal once again is visiting a plant for food, in this case fruit, that's a fig. These are the cactus fruits of saguaros where I live. And then the plant gets its seeds moved because when the animal consumes the fruit, it flies off, it defecates, and the seeds end up in a good place to germinate. In protection mutualisms, these are a little bit different. In this case, one species, once again, is getting food, but in this case, the partner, instead of getting moved, is getting protected from its enemies, predators and parasites and so on. So here we have an ant associated with a tropical acacia species, and these ants are living on the plants, eating food that the plant provides, and then very viciously attacking the herbivores that are on the plant. So that's an ant-plant protection mutualism. In this case, we have a shrimp that's eating ectoparasites on the outside of the fish. Okay, so why is the shrimp doing it? It's just getting food. What is the fish getting out? What's the benefit? It's having its parasites removed. And the idea is that there is a fitness benefit from being cleaned, although it's actually proven very difficult to show whether the fish benefits from that. So these are protection mutualisms. And then the last category I'll mention is nutrition mutualisms. And these are cases in which two species are each exchanging a nutrient that it doesn't have enough of in the relationship. So they're exchanging limiting nutrients. One partner is often gaining protection from the environment as well. So here, for instance, are the nodules on the roots of a soybean plant. So these are little factories for nitrogen. Each one has a large population of rhizobium bacteria inside. And these are mycorrhizae, which are fungi associated with the roots that make limiting phosphorus more available to the plant. So that will give you an idea of the range of mutualisms that I want to talk about. Now, we almost always, when we're introducing the subject of mutualism, we almost always do it the way I just did it. We divide mutualisms up according to what is being exchanged. Now, the interesting thing that I've come to realize in the last couple of years is that this is not very useful if what we're interested in is how fragile mutualisms are, how susceptible they are to being disrupted. So again, I'll use the word fragility, and I realize you may not know that that word. So what I mean is how easy it is for that mutualism to fall apart. If a mutualism is fragile, it's very susceptible to being disrupted. So dividing mutualisms up by benefits isn't useful. So we can't say, it turns out, that pollination mutualisms are more easily disrupted than ant-plant mutualisms. I mean, that's not true, and it's just not a useful way of thinking about it. Now, the interesting thing is that these different classes of mutualism that I've talked about have been very differently studied in a conservation context. And in particular, almost all the work on the conservation of mutualism at this point is about plant-pollinator interactions. So my point is, even though people in conservation focus on plant-pollinator interactions, doesn't mean that plant-pollinator interactions are the single kind of mutualism we need to worry about. It's just that there's more people studying pollination than anything else. And I really think that's all there is to it. So if the benefit involved in mutualism does not predict how fragile a mutualism is, what does? Right? What kinds of traits that mutualisms have predict which ones will be more and less likely to be disrupted, for instance, by fire and by earthquakes and by global change and so on. So we've been thinking about this in my lab and thinking about all the characteristics of mutualism that make them more likely and less likely to break down in the face of human-caused anthropogenic change. So the first thing we can think about is whether a mutualism is symbiotic or involves free-living partners. Now, with symbioses are mutualisms in which the partners are very tightly integrated, physiologically integrated. Very difficult for them to have any individual life apart from being in association. So, for instance, the mutualism between rhizobium bacteria and the roots of legume plants are a good example of a symbiotic mutualism. Well, it turns out, if you think about symbiosis, it's a pretty good situation to be in a very rapidly changing world. One partner is shielded to some extent from the environment. Okay, these bacteria are inside nodules attached to the roots in the soil, which means if the plant does okay, the rhizobium in the roots are probably going to be okay also. The symbiotic partner is often a microbe in very high abundance, and they tend to disperse together. Okay, not this example, but in many cases of symbioses, like with lichens, which are a symbiosis between fungi and algae, the two partners disperse together in the environment. They don't have to find each other. So what that would imply is that symbioses have an ability to persist in the face of anthropogenic change that we might not have predicted. The mutualisms in this way of thinking that we might need to worry about more is the ones involving partners that are free-living, that have separate biologies and that have to find each other to form their interactions. That means each partner separately is going to be subject to abiotic stress. It might be experienced very differently by this hummingbird and that plant. For instance, one might be really susceptible to high temperatures and the other not. But that's a problem for the interaction, right? Because both partners have to find each other. And then again, the partners have to locate each other in time and space. And I'll refer to this problem later, is how do partners find each other? That's not much of a problem in a symbiosis. Now in this example, of course, I'm comparing two extremely different kinds of mutualism. I'm comparing a symbiotic nutritional mutualism and a non-symbiotic pollination mutualism. But I'll return to that in a moment. Now there's another way that we can divide the question, which is whether a mutualism is obligate and specialized or generalized and facultative. Now, what I've just been talking about is whether or not it's symbiotic. Now I'm talking about the level of specialization. So the degree to which there's a one-to-one correspondence. And now, actually, we have a reverse prediction, which is that this mutualism faces a really big problem with anthropogenic change. Because if one of these partners is in trouble, so is the other one. Okay? They cannot switch partners. There's a species-to-species correspondence, and one partner cannot survive without the other. And so even though that interaction is symbiotic, and that would seem to give it some resilience, it's also highly specialized, and that's a problem. Now, conversely, now the hummingbird and the plant would seem to have an advantage, because each partner has other options. This isn't the only flower species that the hummingbird visits for nectar. So if this plant doesn't flower in a certain year, the hummingbird can go elsewhere. Or if the hummingbirds fail one year, this plant can also be pollinated by bees. And some of them don't need to find each other at all. So the plant, for instance, might have the ability to self-pollinate. So interestingly, we can make opposite predictions for these interactions. Now, again, in that example, I was comparing two very different kinds of mutualism. A nutritional mutualism and a pollination mutualism. But we could make the same inference by comparing two pollination mutualisms. So here is the famous example of the yucca moth mutualism, where there is complete dependency of one yucca moth species to one yucca species. So they're obligately dependent and they're species specific. And now, once again, we would see that with regard to this second point, this is the mutualism that should have the bigger problem, because the partners are completely dependent on each other, such that if we lost one, the other would be in a crisis too, unlike that system. The third thing I'd like to mention is the geographic distribution of the interaction. Okay? You can predict that if there is a threat in one region, and if that mutualism, or one partner in that mutualism only occurs in that region, that's a huge problem. So for instance, this is a mutualism I'll mention again in a few minutes. It's an obligate pollination mutualism that's a lot like the yucca moth mutualism, or the fig wasp mutualism. This one happens to involve a cactus and the one moth that pollinates it. And it's only found in a very limited region of Mexico, stretching up into one tiny corner of Arizona. So if there's a threat to that region of the world, if the temperature is rising, for instance, too much for that moth to survive, that interaction in both those species will go extinct. You know, comparatively speaking, a pollination mutualism between bees and a typical composite flower would seem to be pretty resilient, because if one pollinator is locally wiped out, it might be able to move back into that area, and there is an ability for the partners to switch, to move to some extent to a better habitat. Okay, so a narrow endemic clearly has a bigger problem than a widespread species. Now, once again, these predictions are independent of what kind of mutualism we're talking about. I have shown you mostly examples for pollination, but that doesn't mean that pollination is any different from any kind of other mutualism. Well, given those predictions, we can make a suggestion as to which kind of mutualism should be the one that has the worst problem of all. And it should be this. It should be narrowly distributed geographically. It should be obligate in the sense that neither partner can survive or reproduce without the other. And it should be species specific, meaning that each partner has only one species that can do it. Those would seem to be the ones that are most at risk, regardless of the benefits exchange. Okay? So, you know, this was an example that was brought up very early in the 1970s, and I'll have more to say about that a few minutes later. But this has been viewed as the classic mutualism that went extinct because of what humans did. And it's between this bird, the dodo, and a tree that's common name in the region in Madagascar is Tambalokoke. Okay? And the idea is that these are big, hard seeds, and the only way they germinated was to pass through the digestive system of this very large flightless bird. This was Mauritius. Humans arrived in Mauritius in the 1600s and very quickly killed all the dodos. Okay? They are flightless, they were large, they were weird, they were fun to go out and hunt. And humans very quickly eliminated them. And an argument was made in the 1970s that the end of the dodos was the reason that this tree species, the Tambalokoke, was extremely endangered in Mauritius, because the dodo had been its only disperser. Okay? So that interaction would seem to correspond to the situation that poses the greatest risk. Okay? If we want a more contemporary example, we might imagine this one I mentioned between this moth and this cactus. This is the cactus is the Sinita cactus, Lophocereus shoddy, and the moth is Upiga virescens. Now, this is work actually by Ted Fleming, who I understand was just here at the BAT meetings, and a number of you met. Ted was the graduate advisor of Nat Holland, who did the majority of work on this. So that's a nice additional little connection to this, who you have visit here. It's a beautiful cactus. It is very regionally limited and would seem, although not at the moment, to be the kind of mutualism that might be the most likely to be disrupted. Now, that's really interesting. It's really, I think, very valuable to have a prediction of the particular kind of mutualisms that should be the biggest trouble. Because we can identify, we know enough about mutualisms worldwide that we could probably make a list of the mutualisms that we should be most worried about, having no knowledge about whether they're actually under threat or not. Right? Things like the Sanita moth mutualism are ones we need to worry about. But that's a tiny, tiny proportion of all mutualisms. Am I saying that, well, all other mutualisms are fine, right? No, we don't know that. The first thing we need to know is, well, what exactly is it that threatens mutualism? I've sort of not really talked about that yet. What are we doing to the world right now that risks mutualism, and where in the world are those risks the most severe? So I want to move now and talk about what are the major threats to mutualism, okay? And really, I think there's two major categories here that I'd like to point out. The first is habitat fragmentation. When we cut, for instance, into tropical forests and we isolate patches. The second is global climate change in all its many, many forms. Increasing temperatures, increasing fire risks, changing moisture patterns, and so on. So I want to say a little bit about what we know about each of these, particularly involving work in my own lab. Well, with habitat fragmentation, I think there's two things in particular that we need to worry about. The first is if we have an endemic or strictly local interaction, so an interaction that only occurs in one particular place, a bit like that Sanita moth interaction. We need to worry about habitat fragmentation driving that to extinction because of various things we do to that interaction. The other thing is not necessarily the interaction as a whole being disrupted, but the extinction of a narrow endemic partner then feeding into effects on the other partner as well. So some work that, for instance, has been beautiful work done in Argentina a number of years ago and then followed up by Marcelo Aizin and his collaborators have looked at the effect of habitat fragmentations, particularly on systems in which the mutualists must move around, in which they forage over fairly broad areas. If you start fragmenting a habitat, mutualists that are very mobile might not be able to move between patches. For instance, they may not be able to fly over the area that has been heavily disturbed. And I know some work that's gone on here has looked at this kind of question. Now, this was definitely the case in the work in Argentina, where they found that the native pollinators of some of these plants were not able to reach and not able to persist in some of the small fragmented habitats. What they did find was that honeybees moved in. Now, honeybees, of course, are not native to South America. They're from North Africa. But they have been introduced and then invaded here. And it turns out that honeybees have no problem moving among these patches. And we can think of them as rescue mutualists. So yes, they're invasive species, but they came in and the plants are doing okay. Not as good as they would with the native pollinators, but not too bad, because wild honeybees have moved in. Now, often we think of honeybees moving into native systems as being a bad thing, and often they do drive down the abundance of local pollinators. But on the other hand, in this Argentina system, probably the plants wouldn't be able to persist at all if that hadn't happened. And so it's sort of an interesting way of thinking about invasive species and seeing that they have some benefits that we may have overlooked in a conservation context. I'm not saying we should introduce them, but they had some surprisingly beneficial effects on that system. Now, this is a system that one of my postdocs has worked on with a bit of my help. It is a system in Costa Rica that involves orchid bees. So these are bees that spend a great deal of their time, although not all of it, visiting orchids and are critical pollinators. The orchids are completely dependent upon these orchid bees, although orchid bees do other things as well. And what she was interested in was whether the ability of orchid bees to move among habitat patches might not only affect the reproductive success of the orchids because of the bees' ability or inability to move between patches, but might also have genetic effects on the orchids and on the bees, such that if orchid bees were constrained to staying in larger patches, that there would be genetic effects on the different populations, particularly the very small populations of orchids in the smaller patches. So this is what she found. Both orchid bees could move between fragments, but gene flow measurements looking at the bees showed that the larger species is more restricted to large forest patches. So the little orchid bee is zipping around in some of these small patches and to large patches. But the larger bee, who you might think would be the better flyer, cannot get to the smaller patches. And that's altering the genetic structure of the bees, and it's also altering genetic structure of the plants themselves. So this is one little indication of a new tool that has barely been used in understanding the effects of anthropogenic change on mutualism, which is to use genetic indicators of what's going on. So that's a little bit about fragmentation. There's work on how mutualisms are affected, but actually surprisingly little. The other big question is global climate change. And there's a number of things that we need to worry about here with regard to how mutualisms are affected by global change. The first is, direct physiological effects on one or the other partners. So as temperatures rise, as rainfall changes, one individual, one of the two species, being directly affected in a negative way and doing poorly, and then that having consequences for the interaction as a whole. So in particular, my lab has been looking at this in our community of cacti in the Southwest. We have a very rich community of cacti, and many or most of them are associated with ants that defend the plants from herbivores. So here you can see some chromatogaster ants visiting these. The yellow bumps there are extrafloral nectaries. And we know that the plants do better, at least a little better, when they're attended by ants. And we also know that that the plants are a critical source of water and sugar for the ants. Well, one thing that we've studied for a number of years in the lab, and it's very clear, is that for any one of these plants, and this is true in the vast majority of ant-plant defensive mutualisms, many ants are involved in the system. So it's not one ant to one plant. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ants. Well, the ants aren't all the same. And a number of years of study of this in my group in Arizona has shown that these different ant species that are associated with the cacti we study in Arizona. This is chromatic aster, this is a native solenopsis, this is a Forelius. They differ in thermal tolerance. So as the temperature goes up, and it gets to kind of crazy temperatures where I live, I think today is like 45 degrees. Depending on what temperature it is, the different ants are out foraging. At cool temperatures, they can all forage. As the day warms up, one after another of the ants has to go back underground. So we can use that, and the different ants, in addition, are differently good at attacking herbivores. Okay, so some of them, for instance, this is a very fierce ant. It's very good at protecting against herbivores. This ant, the Forelius, is really bad. It mostly runs from danger. Right? It's not an ant that you really want on the plant. Well, it turns out, through our work on this system, we've shown that Forelius, the ant that's the worst mutualist, is also the one that is very, very tolerant of high temperatures. And as we've looked around at data from other ant communities, we see that this is a general pattern, that ants that are competitively superior, that are very aggressive to other ants, that are very aggressive to herbivores, tend not to do well at high temperatures. And that allows poor competitors, like this one, like Forelius, to persist. They have evolved to be specialists at high temperatures, but they're terrible mutualists, right? So the ant that tolerates the highest temperature is the very worst protector. And of course, that has the potential for some very big consequences for the future, because it leads to the prediction that as the globe warms up and as the Sonoran Desert gets hotter and hotter, there will be a turnover in the ant community where you're going to lose all the best mutualists, and you're going to be left with the ones that run from danger. We've shown also that the same thing is not going on with the herbivores. The herbivores love high temperatures. They do even better when it's hot. So in a hotter world, the cactus will survive, the herbivores will survive, but you'll lose the best mutualists. And we're really curious to know if that's going to be a general pattern that you see in other kinds of mutualisms too. Another thing, and this one has gotten far more attention than the problem that I just talked about, is that global change risks disrupting the life cycle timing of individual species, and so of the interaction between the species. So for instance, in a community of plants and pollinators, the plants start flowering and the pollinators show up and pollinate them, and that's how it can be mutually beneficial. Well, it's turning out, and this is from long-term data in Colorado at a study site that I actually go to the day after I get back from Brazil. This is in Alpine, Colorado, is that flowering in this community, which is one of the best studied plant pollination communities in the world, the plants are flowering earlier and earlier every year. They're also flowering for a longer time. But what's really noticeable is that they're flowering earlier and earlier. So, well, that's a little hard to see that way. So the question is, what is going on with the pollinator community? So if the plants are flowering earlier, are the mutualists, are the pollinator mutualists showing up earlier too? If they are, it's not that big of a problem, right? It means the interaction is intact, it's just shifting earlier in the year. So are pollinators shifting earlier? Well, we have 40 years of data on the plant community at this site, and almost no data about the pollinators. Because it's harder to tell, right? It's easy with the plants. There's some, hundreds of permanently marked plots at this site, and every week you go out and you record what's flowering. If you want to know when pollinators are out, you have to sample in a very different way. It's much harder. So this is my graduate student, Paul Caradonna, and he's doing work at this site, putting out nest boxes for bees and seeing when the bees are emerging. and relating that to what the temperature is. He and another student in my group, Amy Eiler, have looked at hummingbirds and looking at when they are coming back from their migration to this site to see, as the plants flower earlier and earlier, are the hummingbirds coming earlier as well? And right now we don't know. It seems as if to some extent pollinators are shifting earlier too, but it's going to be a very complex story. It's going to turn out that some are and some aren't. And that's going to determine which of these pollination mutualisms, and there's hundreds of plants at this site that all require pollinators. Some plants seem as if they're going to be all right, and some won't. Now, we're also doing this in southern Arizona, right around Tucson, and these are some mountains, right, about half an hour from where I do my work. And we're studying this system. It's manzanita, which is Arctostaphylos casei, and it flowers very, very early in our year. It flowers in January, which means that there's still snow in the mountains when these flowers are coming out. And any insect that is out and about at this time of year will be on manzanita because it's a good resource and it's the only thing that's there. Well, we have long-term records on when this plant is flowering. And interestingly, although the world pattern is that plants are flowering earlier and earlier due to anthropogenic change, in this habitat, weirdly, plants are flowering later and later. It is different from the common pattern. It seems to be because in these habitats, the plants are more subject to changing rainfall patterns than to changing temperatures. So this particular plant happens to be shifting flowering later, and the flowering season is compressing. So it's also changing due to anthropogenic change, but in a different way from the pattern in Colorado. And here's Paul, once again, studying the same system there, setting out nest boxes to see when bees are going to come out in the spring in relation to when these plants flower. And so once again, the question is, will pollinators be shifting in concert? And we don't know yet, and it's going to be really exciting to find out. Now, almost only attention to this particular issue, this idea of disruption of phenology, this timing problem. 99% of this work turns out to be about plant-pollinator mutualisms. But I've made an argument to you that conservation of mutualism isn't just about pollination mutualisms, and there's no reason to think pollination is special. Is phenological disruption a wider problem than that? I've been doing some thinking about that, and I'm kind of stuck, but I think it's a really important question. To know, for instance, is it just as much a problem for plant seed dispersal mutualisms? Or is this really a problem that is just about pollination? I don't think it is. Now, I threw this in for Fernanda just to point out there are other issues about global climate change. And one thing, at least in the US, it's a very clear and poorly understood pattern, is that fire frequency has greatly changed for all kinds of reasons, due to climate change, but also the way that we're disrupting environments, due to the way that we suppress or prevent fires that I believe I talked to people about here last year, and there's some similarities. Increased fire frequency. What does that mean for mutualism, right? Does a fire have an equal likelihood of affecting each partner in the interaction? Will it affect some more than others? How do mutualisms reassemble after fires? These are questions we know almost nothing about. I was in a good place and a good time, sort of, to study this a number of years ago. I was working with someone who was working on the yucca moth mutualism. Again, this is all species specific. And we were working around San Diego, California, and a giant fire went through, huge fire, and completely destroyed the study site. And over the next 3 years, we watched the yucca moth mutualism to see how it would reassemble. Okay? I'll have to tell you, it reassembled really, really fast. It turns out that yuccas are adapted to a fire-prone habitat. So the yuccas flowered, even though they looked completely much of their storage is underground. And so they all started flowering again. Right after the fire, the moths were a bit more of a problem. The moths took about 2 years to reestablish, but the interaction within a year or two was back. And it was a very interesting thing to watch, and it made me realize that we know almost nothing about what kinds of mutualisms are more and less subject to disruption by fire. And I think it's a very important thing to do. So can we rescue mutualisms? If all these bad things can happen to them, if timing can be knocked off, if you can lose one partner, what happens, and what can we do about it, right? How do we go in and change things? Well, you know, there's been an assumption, and I think you see this in that talk about the dodo example, which is that there's a huge problem, that the problem about conservation of mutualism is that if we don't do anything, there will be co-extinction. In other words, if we lose one species, we will lose the partner, and they'll both be gone. Now, interestingly, evidence for that, there's virtually no evidence for mutualism, that co-extinction is a problem, that when a bad thing happens to one species, that we lose its partner. We have a bit of evidence that populations fall a bit, but we have even more evidence that there's some kind of resiliency in mutualism. So a number of years ago, when I was still working on the fig pollination interaction, I was working around Miami, Florida, and I had been studying that mutualism there for several years, and a giant Hurricane Andrew, came through, and pretty much destroyed the Miami area. Every single leaf, every single fig that was developing on these trees were blown off in this hurricane. And I watched the interaction to see when, if ever, the fig wasps would get there again and reestablish that relationship. And it took 3 months. And in 3 months, it was completely gone. It seems as if the yucca moths, the fig wasps, had a refuge about 30 miles away in the Everglades National Park. And as soon as these trees leafed out and developed figs, these tiny fig wasps found the trees, and the population built up very, very fast. And that's a situation, for instance, in which you might have expected to see co-extinction. Now, we can go back to that dodo example. You know, the idea that the extinction of the dodo drove the Tambalocoque tree into extinction, but it didn't. The Tambalocoque tree is still with us, even though the dodo isn't, right? So we can ask, what is it about this tree that made it possible for it to persist and not go extinct when we lost the dodo? Maybe it had other dispersers. And that's one major idea of why this happened, is we thought, the original story was that only this one bird distributed the seeds, and maybe that's just wrong. Maybe there's other dispersers that did not go extinct. Maybe there were invasive species that came in and were just as good as the dodo, and so substituted for the dodo, kind of like honeybees are substituting for native pollinators in Argentina. It's not even really clear, of course it's storytelling, right, that the extinction of the dodo was really responsible for why that tree was rare. It's not like anybody watched the Tambalocoque tree get rare. Maybe it was always rare. We don't know, right? So there's lessons to take away from that story, but maybe not the lessons we thought there were. So what is becoming clearer and clearer to me as I think about these questions is that there's traits that buffer mutualism from disruption. In other words, that make mutualisms more resilient than we thought. My general feeling is that if any mutualism was really fragile and really susceptible to disruption by human change, it would probably be gone already, right? Because we are changing the globe a lot, but the globe is a very, very dynamic and changeable place. And so any mutualism that's that fragile, I just don't think we would be seeing it anymore. A bit of an exaggeration. That's not to say we shouldn't worry, but I think mutualisms have a really interesting array of traits that allow them to outlast environmental variation. And so in a number of review papers and synthesis pieces I've been working on with collaborators over the last few years, we've been looking at what those traits are. So I have put the references to some of these articles on these slides. I don't want to go through these conceptual figures, but just to point out that we're trying to generalize, for instance, what these little mutualistic networks look like, and then try to predict what kinds of structure of mutualisms might, for instance, generalization, might allow a mutualism to be somewhat more resilient or somewhat less resilient in the face of change. So here's another one from another partner in which we can predict the different things that happens over evolutionary time when mutualisms are disrupted. For instance, if only one partner survives a crisis, either there's extinction or the mutualism is abandoned. So the plant, for instance, evolves away from requiring pollinators, and it becomes purely self-pollinating. So there's interesting evolutionary implications of what happens when a mutualism is highly endangered. So yes, there are traits that we still need to explore that give mutualism some kind of resiliency. We don't know what those traits are, and we're not quite sure of how they're distributed in nature. But of course, there's another thing, which is that we can go in and we can do something about mutualisms. Once we know which ones are being affected and also which ones we can predict will be affected, we can go in and do things. So for instance, you can, if there is a partner that has been lost in a mutualism, you can reintroduce it. I've tried that without a whole lot of success in yuccas and yucca moths. So go to places where there are yuccas but no yucca moths and bring in the larvae which overwinter in the soil and put them in the soil and see if we can get a thriving population of moths back. Once they are successful for a year or two, their numbers should build up and we should be able to see them. Of course, in the case of habitat fragmentation, there's a huge amount of research on the formation of corridors between fragments that might allow species to move successfully among disrupted habitats that would otherwise be in trouble. We can add habitat. That's what Paul is doing. He's adding these nest boxes not only to see whether pollinator timing has been disrupted, but also to create more nesting habitat for the bees and to build up the bee habitat. And then the last is education. And in my lab, and like I'm sure here, a lot of our goal is to tell people about climate change in particular, the effects of fragmentation, tell them about species interactions, the fact that individual species are not completely occurring in isolation in a habitat, and get people thinking about interactions in entire communities, and change the mindset of people about conservation and about how critical it is for people. What's next? What do we need to do? Well, I think I was laughing right before the talk about what we're always talking about in my lab is what's the question? You know, okay, you have all this data, but what is it you really want to know? And I think, you know, as I've pointed out, the study of mutualism is really, really young. Most of the questions we can all think in this room, think about studying about mutualism, probably nobody has ever asked before. So I think we need to spend time and figure out, you know, what is it we want to know? Okay, what do we want to know about the conservation of mutualism? Well, we want to know which mutualisms are most at risk. Why is that? What part of the globe is that, should we worry about the most? And we want to do that not only in an ecological time frame, you know, what's going to happen next, but we want to think about evolution, because one thing that's also become very clear in recent years is that interactions like species evolve remarkably rapidly in the face of anthropogenic change. So if you start to lose one species, it not only has ecological effects, but it has really interesting evolutionary effects on the species that's left behind. And we want to figure out what those possible effects are and study them. And in this recent paper, we tried to lay out some of the questions for the future in that. But then, we don't only need people sitting around and scratching their heads and having conversations about it. We need more data. There's a lot of data around, but they're not necessarily the right data. Especially, we need data that aren't only on pollination mutualisms and that aren't only on highly specialized interactions. We want to, for instance, remarkably little is known about symbiotic mutualisms and how much at risk they are. I've made some suggestions, but we don't really know. We need to look at highly generalized mutualisms, like these mutualisms between ants and the aphids they protect. We have no idea what the effect of anthropogenic change is on mutualisms like that. So in my group, we're trying to pose testable predictions that cut across systems. So some of the predictions I've been talking about today, this idea of whether an interaction is symbiotic, whether it's obligate or specialized, whether it's endemic or global. We talked about in a paper that came out a few months ago. And the goal is to make predictions and phrase them in a way that you can go out and figure out what the right data are to test. So for instance, this kind of paradoxical question about symbiotic mutualisms, where in one way you would think they'd be more fragile, in another way you'd think they'd be less fragile. Well, frankly, we have no idea how fragile they are. And that's what we need to know. Before we know, we can't test this prediction until we have some data on that. And then you might have noticed the one thing I didn't talk about today, which is a very common way of thinking about mutualism and eventually conservation mutualism, is to use network analysis and to start thinking about how individual species and then entire networks of interactions are connected, and start to make very precise predictions. For instance, about whether the species that are more at risk are ones that, for instance, have higher centrality in the interaction, or are modular networks more susceptible to disruption than less modular networks, and so on. And these are going to be fabulous tools for addressing some of the questions that I've been talking about today. Once again, once we have the data, and then once we use the data to ask these kinds of minimally asked questions that I have been talking about today. So in wrapping up, let me just say that almost none of the data, virtually none of the data I talked about today were collected by me in the lab. I have a wonderful group, and this is a number of the people who did the work that I've been talking about. Sevon did the orchid bee work, Paul does the work, and Amy do the work in Colorado on disrupted plant-pollinator interactions. Nicole did the work in Arizona on disrupted plant-pollinator interactions. And Ginny and Michelle have done the work on ant-plant mutualisms, and in particular, the different thermal tolerances of the ants and what the effect of increased temperature might be. And with that, thank you very much for listening, and once again, thanks for the invitation, and I'm happy to take any questions.